you please summarize your seminar and highlight your main arguments?
Well, my seminar today will talk a lot about the history of drone warfare and try and explain how we got into this world where we're dominated by drones, whether that be in the European theatre with Russia's offensive war against Ukraine, or of course across the Middle East. So it tries to provide some important historical context to explain how we got to where we are today.
In the read-ahead you provided, Prologue, the pursuit of precision, and Epilogue, the legacies of precision, you mentioned the history of precision drone use and the subsequent disastrous impact it can have without the right command. You illustrate the effects of pursuing preciseness through years of warfare, but also offer the knowledge that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Are there any ways to restrain the possession of drones by non-state actors or standardize acquisition and development to reduce the potential security threat?
It's a really good question. It is super difficult. We've been working on this now for the last 2 years alongside the UN Security Council and the UN Office of Counterterrorism. I've been working with UN member states trying to document key examples of how violent non-state actor groups have acquired, developed and deployed drone systems, especially those that they weaponize themselves. Now, the reason why it's so difficult is because we've had this global spread of commercial drone technologies. Something we didn't really have before 2015 onwards, before we all started to get drones for our birthdays or put under the Christmas tree or for the holidays. And these toys have now become potential weapons. Some of them have been weaponized through 3D printed release devices that allow you to release mortars or grenades from them. We saw that with ISIS. Or they've been cannibalized, pulled apart so that bits of those drones can be put together with more advanced drone systems so that they can create more potent weapons. And so when your technology comes from commercial elements, it becomes almost impossible to control them. Now, we've suggested some things. We've worked with some industry partners to try and talk about putting limits on how advanced these drones can get, especially in terms of autonomous capabilities. So trying to stop that next generation of drones falling into the hands of terrorist actors. But it is very, very difficult.
You've served as an advisor to leading security institutions and governments, but you are also renowned for your work as an academic and a professor. How have your roles as educator and advisor impacted each other and your understanding of drones and security, respectively?
Yeah, so I focus on war in pretty much everything I do, and I've focused on war for around the last 15 years now. Now, that isn't because I love war or want wars to take place. Instead, I think you should study war to make peace, which is something they do here at Notre Dame. With that in mind, the academic study of war means that you can't have any disciplinary barriers in place, or at least in my personal opinion, you shouldn't. War is one of those topics that is truly multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. It affects every part of our lives and draws on every discipline and every part of society in order to make it something that is waged, whether that be political science and the decision by politicians to actually go to war, down to the engineers that make the systems, or those who work in logistics that do the supply lines, or all of us who may be drafted one day to fight in wars. And so for me, that academic study and not having the boundaries around it is perfectly ideal for them when you try and advise policymakers, because you can draw on lots of different types of academic knowledge in order to try and inform those who work at the front line of policy to try and mitigate those future conflicts and ensure we have peace.
Regarding education, you seem to have perfectly balanced studying the new, drones and region expansion, and innovating the old, studies of IR. Many students today are trying to find creative lenses to approach security studies. What advice would you give students on approaching interdisciplinary research when examining topics like drones and international security?
Well, if it comes down to drones specifically, then I'd always state that we need to understand the technology itself. Now, I'm a social scientist by training. I have a background in history and also in political science, specifically in international relations theory. That's what my degrees are in. But once I decided that I thought drones were particularly important of how they're going to transform the future of warfare and potentially pose threats back to the United States and key NATO allies, then I knew I needed to understand the technical aspects. And so for those who want to study those elements, you need to understand the engineering. Increasingly, you need to understand the computer science and the software elements, not just the hardware. So, don't pigeonhole yourself in one particular area. Be open to other forms of knowledge, because that's the only way you're going to understand how these emerging and disruptive technologies are going to impact the world and how we can mitigate that impact.
In your recent article, Arctic Drones, a New Security Dilemma, you mentioned the expansion of the drone-based security dilemma as it pertains to the Arctic. Do you foresee traditional pacifist countries near the Arctic abandoning their principles and investing in drones or other security means to mitigate the impacts of Russia and China? What do you think this would spell out for the future of the security dilemma?
I think we've already seen those traditionally impartial, neutral countries take a stance. When you're faced by a renewed offensive Russia that has broken one of the most important principles of our international norms, that is violating the sovereignty of another nation state, then you have to pick a side. And so Sweden has done this. We've also seen that traditionally actors who we might perceive to be neutral have actually quite for a long time been part of NATO. Iceland, for example, the country of peace with the capital of peace in Europe, is a NATO member and is firmly involved in making sure that NATO countries in the Arctic have a really strong posture against increasing Russian and Chinese activity coming out of that vital Northern Sea route into the UK, Greenland, Iceland gap. And so what we're seeing is those countries working together. And in my work, we're seeing them buy drones that are interoperable between forces. These aren't armed drone systems. These are larger, medium altitude, long endurance systems or high altitude systems like the Global Hawk that are unarmed and are able to provide persistent overwatch of key strategic areas so that you can keep an eye on Russia and also increasing Chinese activity in that region. Because if you don't have that situational awareness, you might end up having misunderstandings that could lead to escalation and then of course the outbreak of conflict, which is what nobody wants. And so I hope that as we see these countries club together to take on Russia in the future, then we see more of a deterrence of Russian aggression and more peace, not war.